Welcome, everyone. This is American Revolution. I am your host, Andrew Meyer. Today we have the most special of guests for you. Today we have Scott Adams, the acclaimed author, the legendary Dilbert cartoonist, a trained hypnotist, and a student of persuasion. Scott Adams, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
Absolutely my pleasure. The first thing I wanted to talk to you about, absolutely, is your new book, Loserthink. It's been described by some as a guide for helping people escape mental prison. What are one of the best ways it helps people escape mental prison?
Well, the first way is to see all the examples of, let's say, inefficient thinking. And Loserthink is about the gaps that people might have in their mental model, their ability to see the world clearly that they're not aware of, because they might not have had experience in the domains where people learn to think in different ways. So, for example, if you were an artist, you might not know how an economist would approach analyzing a situation. Likewise, if you were a scientist, you might not have as much imagination as an artist. So it's not about somebody being best. It's about filling in the gaps very easily without having to learn economics, just learning some of the basics of how they think, and some of the other fields such as psychology, so that you have a more complete way to analyze the world. So that's what Loserthink is all about. What was your question? I think I did a long introductory before I answered your question, and then I forgot your question.
What are some of the ways it helps people escape mental prison? That's what I really want to know.
So the first way is to know all the mistakes so you don't make them, so you can look at things more clearly. But more specific to your question, one of the things I recommend is that you make sure you're sampling the news from both the left and the right. So you could easily find yourself in a bubble if you're only sampling one side. It doesn't matter which side. If you're only looking at one side, you're not hearing what the other people are saying. I was dealing with this just this morning on Twitter. So one of my many critics came after me. It was obvious from his comments that he had never been exposed to any news originating from the right. Because if he had, nothing he said would he have said, because he would have understood the whole picture. So it's very common. So I tell people, if they're watching CNN, when the pharmaceutical commercials come on and they start listing all the problems that you don't yet have, but you might if you listen to this commercial, it's like you've got diarrhea and your hair is exploding and you'll never have sex again if you take this drug. I say, before any of that gets in your head and pollutes your brain, rapidly turn to the other news station. So if you're Fox, go to CNN. If you're on CNN, go to Fox. And just use the commercials as your cue to check out the other side. I do that, and it helps a lot. The other thing I recommend is that if you're testing your worldview and you're trying to see, do you see the whole field or are you in a bubble? The best way to know is to determine if your worldview predicts. Because if what you think is true doesn't help you predict what will follow, you probably have a dysfunctional worldview. So always put your predictions in writing or put them out in the world so that you can't selectively forget the ones you got wrong, which we do automatically. So tell a friend, write it down, put it in a tweet, then somebody will remind you when you get your predictions wrong. And that can help you be a little bit more humble about how confident you are about your view of the world.
That makes me think of when you have a friend that, you know, everybody thinks that they see things as the right way. They think that they have the right view of the world. I think when you put this to the test, that's a great method. You say to your friend, okay, let's make a prediction about how this will turn out. And when we see the outcome, maybe one of us will have to readjust how we see things. That sounds pretty smart to me.
All right, let me give you an example. So I've got a background in hypnosis. I'm a trained hypnotist, and I've been studying persuasion stuff forever. So when the story came out about the Cuban embassy perhaps being subject to a secret sonic weapon of some sort, I recognized that immediately because I've studied mass hysterias and other forms of persuasion and that sort of thing. I recognized it easily as something that is most likely, and again, you can only deal in probability, Most likely, as in 90% likely, that it was no sonic weapon at all. So I put that prediction out there. I believe I was the only person in the world who made a prediction that all the news was wrong and it wasn't a sonic weapon. So I put it out there. And sure enough, months and years have gone by. They can't find a trace of a sonic weapon, but there have been a few other theories about what might have caused the damage in the people, as I imagined. So put your prediction out there. In this case, I had a little extra visibility because I know about mass hysterias. If you know they exist, that'll help you a little bit. But if you know how common they are, it'll help you a lot, because mass hysterias are it's almost the operating system of the planet. We're always in one mass hysteria or another. And once you learn to see them, you have clearer vision on stuff such as the secret sonic weapon at the Cuban embassy.
Just thinking out loud, you saying that, it makes me wonder if people ever take a step back and think, okay, everybody that is on the mainstream media for the most part, a lot of them predicted Hillary would win in 2016, for example. Do they take a step back and say, well, everybody that I believed in for predictions was wrong, and people like Scott Adams were right? Do you think that there's an amount of people that are reassessing where they get their information based on this?
Yeah, actually, I saw a number of people reassessing it on Twitter this morning, and what they reassessed is that I must be a huge racist because I'm supporting Trump. That's as close as they came to self-awareness. Yeah, we predicted everything wrong, but how can we explain this after the fact? Oh, I think the cartoonist is probably a racist. What else could it be?
Right. One thing that I thought that you were doing that might help wake people up, I want to get your view on this, is sometimes when you describe a tactic that people do, one of which is the laundry list. When people don't have a real argument, they make a list of 10 things to try and make it seem like a strong argument. Do you think you're pointing this out either on Twitter or in your book, Loserthink? Do you think that just describing this method and people will maybe see them doing it themselves and maybe reassess, oh, maybe I don't really know what I'm talking about here?
Yeah, that's my hope. My hope is that I've given enough examples and call-outs in the book that people will mock them when they see other people doing it, which reduces the amount it gets used because nobody likes to get mocked. But they'll also recognize it in themselves. Now, the laundry list, the thinking behind it is that when people have one or two good reasons for whatever their opinion is, they will lead with those one or two good reasons. Now, there might be 10 other minor reasons, but they're not going to list them because they want to win the debate. So, all right, here's my two good reasons or my one good reason. So if somebody has one or two good reasons, they might have a good opinion, and maybe you should listen to it. But when somebody has 10 reasons, it's because they know that none of them are strong. So it's really trying to turn a bunch of zeros into something by adding them together. So it creates the illusion of a reason. But if you were to look at any of them individually, you'd say, well, there's not much there. So what I recommend when people come at you with the laundry list is that you ask, okay, in the interest of time, what's the one best, strongest point on your list? Because would you agree, and this is part of the technique, you say, would you agree that if I can debunk your best point, and that alone, that's the only one I'll do, that you'll go back and rethink the other points? Now, most people will say, yeah, sure, because they think they're going to prevail. But, if you can't debunk their best point, well, maybe they have a point. But if you can, it's pretty powerful to say, okay, that was your best point. Everything else on your list, by your own judgment, is less good point than the one I just destroyed right in front of you. So maybe you should rethink it. So that's a technique.
That's awesome. I'm going to pivot a little bit back to the book that you wrote right before Loserthink, which was Win Bigly. Win Bigly, for people that don't know, a lot of it had to do with Donald Trump. A lot of it had to do with just a way of seeing the world. I personally, I didn't quite understand what Trump was doing in the primaries. I liked some of the things he had to say, but I didn't understand his method of speaking until I started reading your blog back in about August of 2015. And then I totally understood everything he was doing, and I helped people that thought he was insane or really dumb, like, understand that he was incredibly talented as a persuader. So you've been in this world talking about political commentary for a while now. The first thing I just wanted to ask is, what have you learned from entering the world of political commentary?
Well, I'm not sure that I was surprised by anything, because if you watch it just as a spectator, you kind of get all the parts. So I can't think of anything that turned out to be a great surprise. I did lose, most of my friends and a third of my income and growing. But I kind of knew that was the risk going in. And I was in a strange position that I can afford it. So I thought, well, how odd that if you were to look at the landscape of news people and pundits and whatever, almost none of them are even making an attempt to be unbiased. It's just not even a thing. People are not even pretending to be anything but team players. And I thought, I don't vote. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a conservative. I consider myself left of Bernie, but I'm better at math. So some of Bernie's ideas don't pencil out. So I'm not in favor of those. But I like, a lot of freedom and et cetera, treating people nice. So I like a lot of the things that the left likes. But I don't like systems that don't work. And the left is not good at developing systems that work. So that's where we differ. So I thought, well, I'll just bring my totally, in my estimation, relatively unbiased approach, and I'll look at technique. I'll look at Trump's ability to persuade. I'll look at, branding and political slogans. Are they good or are they not? And I'll try to divorce myself from the political content whenever that's practical. Sometimes I don't do that. But I thought, hey, there's this room in the market for somebody who's not being paid off. And in fact, somebody who's willing to lose money by stating unpopular ideas in public if they make sense. So I thought, well, it's sort of a service to the world, in a sense, to just have this other kind of voice filling a gap. I think the world is better when you have lots of variety and diversity and opinions, et cetera. So I thought, I can fill this gap that's unfilled, and I can take the heat, I can take the price, I can pay the price, and not many people could. So I thought, well, perfect place for me. So I did kind of drift into it, though. I mean, it wasn't some master plan. It happened because I wrote a blog post about Trump, and that just led to more and more stuff. And the next thing I know, I'm doing a live stream Periscope every day, 7 a.m. California time. So it just sort of grew.
Well, personally, I thank you, and I'm sure there's like hundreds of thousands of people that appreciate what you've done, if not millions, that have seen you on Fox as well.
Start with the millions.
Yeah, start with the millions. Millions of people, yes, millions of people, definitely.
Yeah, let me restate that. We don't know how many millions of people are watching you, Scott.
We don't know.
Tens of millions. We don't know.
Yes.
So next time.
We don't know how many of the billions on Earth are watching you, but I'm sure everyone appreciates it. Speaking of your view of Trump and all of that, I wanted to ask you, because you've spoken so much about his influence and his humor, I wanted to ask if there was something that he tweeted, especially, if there's one Trump tweet that has stuck out to you for its influence or its humor that you keep remembering back to.
Well, I'm always more influenced by what has come lately. My brain is like everybody else's. If it happened recently, it just seems more important. And his latest one today about Mini Mike, Bloomberg, had me laughing for 10 minutes. And as bullying and as petty as it is to call your competitor small, like physically small, which is something Trump does all the time. First of all, I'm 5'8", so I'm not in favor of bullying people who are short, but it certainly works. Because when you're talking about somebody who's running to be a leader of a country, our non-critical parts of our brain are really strong in terms of the decision making. Our rational mind, we think that's how we're making our decisions. It's like, oh, I like these policies, but in fact, we're basically just these animals with clothes. And when we see a strong leader, we're more attracted to that person than a weak leader. And one of the proxies for strength, and again, it makes no sense. So I'm not saying there's any logic to this. It's just, we uncritically and irrationally look at somebody who's large and they just seem more powerful than somebody who's physically small. Now, of course, to be a president, you don't need to be tall, but we still process it that way. So the president's instincts about what will move the needle are really good. I don't know if this is as good as his best work, which was low energy Jeb, but that took Jeb completely out of the race, and he was almost guaranteed to get the nomination until a nickname happened. It was really the nickname that framed him, so that I went from seeing Jeb Bush as this calm, collected executive, and I thought, that's exactly the kind of personality you want in our crazy world. You want the calm, experienced executive. And the moment that Trump reframed him as low energy, that's all I saw. It was over. That's all I could saw. And now with Mike Bloomberg being branded Mini Mike, every time you see him in public, you're going to look at where his head is compared to the other people in the picture. That's all you're going to see. So it's devastatingly effective, even if you think it's unethical, unfair, or whatever else it is. It's all of those things, but it's also effective.
You got me thinking. I know that influence is obviously a huge part of the picture, but do you think someone that's on the shorter end of the scale could ever win the presidency in this day and age? Like someone like Rand Paul, let's say that he had Trump's skills rhetorically. Could he ascend to the presidency at his height? Or it doesn't matter. It's all about the whole total package and the persuasion skills.
Well, I can win the presidency just because I have the right skill set. So I'm short, and I could almost certainly win the presidency because I have exactly the set of skills to do it. Now, in a real world, I can't because they would dig into every little fake news in my background. They'd find something. So I wouldn't run. It would be a ridiculous thing for me to do. But somebody with my skill set, let's depersonalize it for a moment. I'll just say somebody with my skill set would certainly be able to run for president and win.
Speaking of your skill set, you told Wired recently that you were always curious about writing a book where you would use the hypnosis skills embedded with the writing to give the reader a better experience. So I have to ask, are you hypnotizing people with your daily streams? Are you hypnotizing them with the simultaneous sip?
Yes, but I'm doing it with permission, meaning that all the regulars who watch it, maybe if you're tuning in for the first time, you might have some issues of understanding what's going on. But I always lead my audience through what I call the simultaneous sip, where I have a little introduction and I have them sip their coffee or whatever at the same time. It's a hypnosis technique, and it's based on pacing. So I'm getting everybody to do something I want that's very, very small. And when people do something you want that's small, it primes them to be flexible about future things. It makes them bond with you, etc. But I tell people I'm doing it, so there's nothing underhanded about it. And it's one of the things people call out to me as one of their favorite parts of it, because they can feel the influence, not on day one, but if they keep watching it every day, and it runs every day. If you watch it enough, sooner or later, you're going to reach for that cup or that mug when it's time to do it. And people tell me funny stories about, I tried to resist. I tried to resist for weeks, but then I tried it, and it was much better if I did it at the same time as you. Damn it, it's working. So that's just for fun, and I do it with full disclosure.
I made the conscious decision. I will not let my brain be hacked. I will not take the sip. I did not want to be controlled on that level. I will not take the sip, Scott. But
and how was the sip when you finally took it?
I'll take it right now. My first simultaneous sip. If you got some water with you right now, I'll roll with you right now.
I don't have one with me, but well, let me tell you this, Andy. Think about how it feels to resist the simultaneous sip. And now imagine how good it would feel if you didn't resist and you became one with all of the people who are sipping all over the world at exactly the same time.
I had to start putting my fingers in my ears. I don't want I don't want the brain hack.
Just imagine the difference between them. Quite a contrast. Quite a contrast.
Speaking of maybe brainwashing people for the good or helping people with your skills, you said recently that when you submitted your first Dilbert comic strips, you didn't think the art was good enough, but someone told you that it was fine. And you said the simple statement that you could do it made the quality of your art improve 500% in 2 weeks. What would you say to everybody watching about, what they can do? What can you tell people that would really help them?
So that what you're referring to was sort of a Wizard of Oz moment for me. I thought my artistic skills were not good enough to be a professional cartoonist. And in fact, a professional editor of cartoons had told me exactly that and suggested that I find an actual artist to do the drawing for me. So when another editor later said, no, it's great, it's fine, I was hearing from a reliable, credible, expert source that everything was fine. And I took that as true because it was coming from such a good source. And almost immediately, I became better at drawing. And that you see that phenomenon over and over again. So confidence boosts your performance in just about everything. Overconfidence can be bad. And I'll give you another example. When I took the Dale Carnegie course years ago, it was a course for people to learn how to do public speaking, specifically if they were completely afraid of it. I mean, people who just couldn't even get a word out. I mean, literally would stand in front of the crowd, in the classroom in the first weeks, and they actually couldn't speak, couldn't form a word.
Wow.
They were that afraid. And there was a whole class full of people who were bad at speaking. And by the end of the class, every one of us were expert, comfortable speakers. We could do it with no practice, with ease. And the only technique the Dale Carnegie process uses is compliments. That's it. They just tell you what you did right. And they have a rule that nobody in the class, and especially the instructor, can ever tell you anything you did wrong.
Wow.
And so you just think, really? I thought I did a terrible job. But that one part of it you said was good? And then they build up your ego from nothing until you formed a full functional ego that allows you to stand in front of 1,000 people, as I have many times, live audiences, and feel as comfortable as if you're just watching TV. And it's all because of the power of positive reinforcement. No negative, no tips, no instruction, no details of what you should have done differently, nothing. And it changed everybody. 100% success. It was the most amazing thing I've ever seen live. So that's a little lesson to take with you. And one of the things that I learned from that, and it's explicitly taught in the Dale Carnegie course, is that if you feel a compliment that you're thinking of giving someone else, they've done something well, and you have this internal thought of, wow, that was really well done. If you don't voice it, it's almost immoral. It borders on, it's not bad behavior, but it's so close to it that you shouldn't be proud of it. Because simply voicing it, which costs you nothing, there's no expense. And in fact, people will like you better. So if you don't let that compliment out, knowing what an enormous difference it could make in the life of another person, really enormous. A small compliment from the right person at the right time is life-changing. And if you don't let that compliment out when it forms in your mind, you really have to ask yourself, are you a good person? Because keeping that inside it's not exactly stealing, but it feels like amazingly selfish behavior. So that's one of the things I learned.
That's fantastic. I was listening to that and thinking that that should be applied, especially to parenting. There's so many people that they'll easily put down their kids' abilities or whatever, but if they give them compliments for what they're doing right all the time, you can turn your kids into superheroes using that technique.
Well, I would caution that kids are a special case because their brains are not fully formed. So I'm a big fan of lots of positive reinforcement, but sometimes you just have to tell the kid, don't do that. There are plenty of those cases. So I think with an adult, you could get away with nothing but positive reinforcement, as in my example. But with a kid, you're going to have to modify that for the age of the kid, I think.
Good to know. I actually brought up, so we were talking about Trump. I brought up one of the old cartoons you did. I don't know if anybody's ever asked you this exactly on the nose, but you wrote in 1990 a cartoon where one of the characters is essentially coming from Russia and is asking to learn about capitalism. And one of your characters, Dogbert, is sitting down with the Russian, and the Russian is asking, "And your god is this Donald Trump?" And Dogbert says, "I don't think it's official yet." You're seeing ahead of time, Donald Trump's abilities. What did you see in 1990 that made you write such a strong cartoon?
Well, I don't know how strong it is, but I'll say this. Trump was famous as being the most famous capitalist. Now, I was just using him as a reference that everybody would understand. He was sort of an interesting, fun reference at the time for just a generic rich guy. So that's really all I had in my head. But the preview of the future is that the reason he came to mind is that he has an amazing ability to stick in your head, to get in your head. And then he took that ability and more and became president of the United States. So the fact that I thought of him when there were lots of other rich people in the world, but that's the one I thought of, that's not an accident. He has that skill of making you think of him. So, it wasn't quite a prediction, but it wasn't an accident either. It was recognizing the skill set, but in a different filter.
That's incredible. I always wanted to hear your take on that, because seeing that cartoon, and you're the only one basically in the public that had made such a strong thing back at that time. I had to ask you about that.
And how weird is it that it was being asked by a Russian character?
You're right.
In 1989.
I didn't even think of that. That's incredible. Yeah.
So, one of the things I write about in Loserthink is that we make too much of coincidence. Now, everybody knows that's true, that we make too much of coincidence. But until you see these kinds of examples, that you say to yourself, what's going on here? This couldn't possibly be a complete coincidence. I mean, it looks almost magic. But in fact, it's not a complete coincidence. As I said, there was a reason that he stuck in my mind, and it's the same reason he became president. But it's not an obvious reason.
This makes me think of affirmations, which I was going to ask you about later, but I'll bring it up now. And I've got a copy of your book here, How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big. Now, no disrespect to any of your other books. They're all great. This is my favorite Scott Adams book right here, How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big. And one of the things that you talked about in the book is you discuss at length affirmations and how helpful they are. Can you tell people how useful have affirmations been to your life, and what suggestions do you have for them on affirmations?
So affirmations, the way it's being used in this conversation, is the practice of repeating to yourself or writing down simple sentences about what you want to attain. So it might be something like, I, Scott Adams, want to be wealthy, or I, Scott Adams, want to be a famous cartoonist. I, Scott Adams, want to have a best-selling book. I've done all of those as affirmations, and all of those things happen. Now, the thing that I must quickly say in the beginning of this conversation is that I don't believe in magic. So I don't think that you're repeating a spell or something. I don't think that's happening. And it could be just an illusion. It could be that the reason I do the affirmations is that I think I'm talking about something that could happen because I have a pretty good idea of my skill set. So maybe on a subconscious level, the only things I choose to repeat to myself are things that had a pretty good chance of happening. So you don't know what's the causation. Is it, which direction? That said, the process of repeating affirmations will produce a sensation of almost having magical powers. Now, it could be a perceptual thing. It could be because we're a simulation. We're a software simulation, not a real civilization. That's a longer discussion. But that would make sense that you could somehow steer your reality within a simulated world. It could be, and this is my best guess. So if I had to explain why affirmations appear to work without stating that they work, I would say that it could be because focus makes you more effective. So if you have lots of things you would like, that doesn't really focus you very well. But if you say, for example, when I was saying I, Scott Adams, will become a cartoonist, I suddenly noticed things I wouldn't have noticed. I noticed a TV show on how to become a cartoonist. I just started picking up things because my filter, I want to be a cartoonist, was set, and I would repeat it over and over, and then my perceptions would open up. Now, there's actually some science behind that. There's something called a reticular activation. It's the effect where, if you're in a crowded room and there's a background murmur, blah, 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 and then you hear blah, 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 Scott, blah, and you're like, what the hell? It was all just a murmur, but I could clearly make out my name. And the reason is that your filters are set for your name. So you can pick it out of background noise pretty easily. Likewise, and this is just speculation, if you set your filter by using your affirmations, I will get this or do this, you're probably also accidentally expanding your awareness or what you could notice. And it would make you notice things that would be useful that you wouldn't have noticed. Now, the other possibility is that if you're not willing to repeat your goal 15 times a day, which is not a lot of work, right? You're talking about a couple of minutes. If you're not willing to do that, you're probably also not willing to do whatever it takes to succeed or get the thing you're talking about. So it could be that if your subconscious, let's say, allows you to spend 2 minutes a day chanting your little affirmation, it could be that your subconscious, is also willing to put in the work, to put in the sacrifice to get it done. So I don't know if affirmations work. I don't know if you could test it in a laboratory or anywhere else, but they have the sensation of working, and at the very least, they focus you. So I think I put it out there as something worth trying. And I hear from people all the time that they did their affirmations and something that bordered on magic happened. Now, I don't think it's magic, but I will tell you that people experience it almost as if it had to be magic.
Well, whatever it is, we're streaming right now on Mike Cernovich's Facebook page. He's also written about the power of affirmations in his book, Gorilla Mindset. And the two of you both saying how effective they've been, I have to say there's a lot to that. And I've seen a little bit of that in my own life as well. So I had to put that out there for people. Now, you've called, I want to switch up a little bit and ask you a little bit of hard news type questions. Just because I've got you here, I got to get your opinions on this stuff. You've called for decoupling from China. Now, I've said for a while that it might be in the U.S. best interest to embargo China altogether, considering that a lot of the labor there is essentially slave labor with the way they force people to work. Do you think that it would be a wise idea, a viable idea for the U.S. to embargo China?
Well, it depends what embargo means. I think that we're best off taking the president's approach of treating them respectfully, especially their leader, Xi, because that goes a long way. So you can do tough things, including sanctions and tariffs and decoupling and all that stuff, if you're respectful about it. That gives you a little bit of maybe safety. I've said that we should decouple from China because there's no way we'll ever get an agreement that is fair, because China has no interest in a fair agreement and never will. At least that's the indication. Now, at the moment, they're involved in what I call a quadruple Holocaust. Now, not everybody knows this, but more people are finding out about it. And what I mean is for example, They have rounded up and put in concentration camps most of the Uyghur males in the Uyghur minority. Now, it gets even worse. Apparently, the reports are that China is assigning a rapist for the wives left behind when their husbands went to the concentration camp. Now, they don't call them rapists, but they do sleep with the wife, and they're there to re-educate the family while the husband's off getting re-educated in the camp. That's pretty bad. But even worse, there's very solid evidence that they're killing people on demand for body parts and then selling them, because there's a big market for hearts and lungs and kidneys and stuff. And that apparently they're killing members of the Falun Gong minority specifically on demand. You know, if they need a kidney, they're like, well, grab a Falun Gong guy and kill him and take his kidneys. Now, we know that there's on demand because in China you can get any body part on your schedule. That's not possible. If you're waiting for people to die naturally, you can't schedule it. All right, you have to be lucky that you're on the list. Somebody died, and they even have to die close to you. I mean, they can't even die across the country. There's not enough time to get the parts there. So we have a pretty good idea that's the second Holocaust. They're actually harvesting parts from the politically unpopular Falun Gong people. Then you've got Hong Kong, which is not a Holocaust yet, but I think it's going in that direction. I don't see any way that it will not go that way. And then, of course, China, and this is close to me, China is sending fentanyl to the cartels in Mexico, and they're shipping it into this country. And it's killing, 50,000 people a year? Now, China knows the name and address of the guy who's doing it, the main guy. There's more than one, but there's one main guy. CBS actually found the guy in China at a market, 60 Minutes, and they interviewed him. He's that easy to find. The 60 Minutes just found him. So our government has told their government, here's the guy, here's his name, here's his picture. They know where he is. He's still a free man. So China's obviously okay with killing 50,000 Americans a year through fentanyl overdoses. And that's sort of the fourth Holocaust. Now, in terms of a trade deal, they're also going to, there's no real chance they're going to stop stealing our intellectual property. I don't see there's any chance. They might, make some agreement and then find a way around it. But we don't have anything to gain by staying with China and their four Holocausts. But we probably could decouple slowly. So the American companies that are already working over there, I wouldn't yank them out tomorrow, but I certainly would shame any company that thought that deciding to move operations, let's say manufacturing, into China, anybody who thought that was a good idea because the money was good, the cost structure, they need to be shamed out of that opinion. And I think that's going to happen over time. So I think over time, we will decouple. I just don't think we need to necessarily announce it.
That's smart. I like that. I like that approach. For a long time, I remember being a kid and just learning about Chinese sweatshops. My first education on what was happening in China, why everything's made in China, and thinking, why are we doing business? And then you learn all the things that you were discussing, and it's like, to me, it's totally immoral to be doing all this business with China.
Yeah. The slave labor thing, I have a more nuanced opinion on. So that there's a reason I didn't mention it in my list of grievances, because you could easily imagine that that's actually still the best option for the slaves. I mean, they're not slaves in the sense that they're not getting paid, but they're probably people who didn't have a lot of options. And if their option is work 14 hours when you're 12 years old and you can eat, it's tough to tell them they can't have that option. So while we should certainly work toward getting rid of that situation if we have any influence at all on it, you have to realize that people are making rational choices, and maybe they just have terrible choices. So I wouldn't want to take away the one that is least terrible and leave them with something even worse, which is no job at all, I suppose.
That's true. Although, for me, I mean, there's a lot of third world economies we could do business with. China, in particular, is notorious for having forced farmers into the cities to the point where, you know, there's some Apple contractors in China. They had to put nets around the building because so many of the workers were jumping to their death. But I don't want to belabor China. Yeah, nobody's a big fan of China that knows what's going on there. Anyway, one other geopolitical question I wanted to ask you. Do you think there's a win-win with everyone's talking about Mexico and the cartels? It's finally people are noticing what a big influence they have in the U.S. Do you think there's a potential win-win with President Trump negotiating with the cartels? One thing I had heard is it's maybe a plan for Trump to try and push them in the direction towards legitimization, where their business, instead of drugs and illegal migrants, would be maybe to, you know, build factories in Mexico and other places. Do you think there's a potential win-win there?
Well, that's in the category of long shot, but if all it takes is a conversation to find out if there's anything there, you know, I'm always in favor of conversations, even if it's with dictators and cartel leaders and anybody else, because you never know. I mean, it's a long shot. I would say this: as long as the drugs that Mexico is shipping to the United States are illegal in this country, it wouldn't matter if the cartels decided not to be cartels, because it would just be a new cartel. It's so lucrative that there's nothing you can do to stop it. Money is just too big of a deal. But if you negotiated with them at the same time you legalized drugs in this country, they would know that their old sources of income are going away. And there might be, I mean, you could imagine it. It's really a stretch, but you could imagine that at least the leadership of the cartels would say, you know, maybe this would be the time to launder my illegal money with permission, launder it into investments in factories and jobs so that we don't even have as much illegal immigration in return for some kind of amnesty or pardon. So you can imagine it, but I would think that the details of that are just so hard. You know, it's not impossible, and it's definitely maybe worth a shot, you know, put a feeler out there. But I don't know, what happens if 3 cartels say yes and 1 says no? I mean, you know, you still have 1 cartel providing all the drugs that you have now eventually. So it's a tough one. If you don't make the drugs legal in this country to take away their source of revenue, there's nothing else you can do. Now, what I would imagine is that we're almost certain to have military action against the cartels. So if I had to predict, I would say the odds of something exploding in cartel territory in the next 12 months are really high, as in headquarters and production facilities and probably automobiles that have cartel members in them. They're just going to start exploding. And that's when things will get ugly, because we would expect the cartels to retaliate, and probably in this country.
You had me thinking about an interesting follow-up to solving the drug problem, but I don't know how much time I have, so I don't want to keep going on that. But I could talk about that for a long time. I have a bunch of books with me here, most of which were recommended to me by you. I have Influence by Robert Cialdini. I have How to Hypnotize Anyone by the Robed Hypnotist. I have Reframing by Bandler and Grinder. And I have My Voice Will Go With You, which is stories, the teaching tales of Milton Erickson. If you were to tell people some of the most useful books that they could read to, you know, change their life, improve themselves, would any of those be on the list? And what books do you recommend?
Well, hypnosis itself is almost impossible to learn from books. So reading them will tell you about it, but it won't necessarily make you a hypnotist. The Influence book is by far the best of the ones you mentioned. And then I would also recommend Habits by Charles Duhigg. That's a real strong one. And my book, Win Bigly, I think completes that. I also look at Thinking Fast and Slow, Slow and Fast, Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman. Those would be, I would say, the foundational books. If you meet somebody who's familiar with the books I just mentioned, you're almost certainly meeting somebody who's already successful or on their way. Those are powerful books.
Yeah, The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. I got the audio book on that one because of you. So thank you for that one as well. Real quick, since we're talking about influence, at any given time, what percentage of people do you think can be persuaded by any type of method to change their mind eventually on their core beliefs?
Well, it depends on the method. So if the method of persuasion is tweets and ads on TV and stuff, you're really looking at 100 million people. I don't know how many people vote, 170 million, something in that range. So you're looking to really move 1% of them. If you can move some of the independents, that's enough to win the presidency. So in the mass persuasion way, if you're just sending out persuasion to everybody without customizing it for the person, maybe you get 1 or 2%. Most people are still going to vote for the team that they started with. But if you could have unlimited time, one-on-one, with a highly influential hypnotist type person, with one person, you could over time convince them of anything. You just need enough time. If you have the technique, it's just time. So you could convince anybody of anything. You could change their religion. I mean, you could fundamentally rewire somebody if you had enough time one-on-one. But if it's mass production, you're moving 1 or 2%, and it might take you a year to do that.
All right, I'm going to have 1 or 2 more questions and then let you go. This is such a great opportunity. I have to ask, you were recently interviewed on American Thought Leaders, an incredible interview. I recommend people watch that as well. And that got me wondering, who are some of the thought leaders that influence your thinking?
Well, the books I mentioned for sure. I would put it this way. I'm so deep into the self-help, kind of world that I don't see too many things that surprise me. So I'll rephrase your question and answer it more productively. I would say that if you're not following Jordan Peterson, you're just missing a treasure, of just, his view of the world. I would say you want to follow, so far, seems to be the smartest person in the world. I would listen to anything Warren Buffett says, anything that Bill Gates says. And those are some of the big ones. I would listen to Mike Cernovich too, as one of your thought leaders. That's a good start right there.
Excellent list. I appreciate it. Has Joe Rogan had you on yet? Because he absolutely has to if he hasn't.
Yeah, I was on once. I'm the sort of guest that I don't really see going on more than once. People fall into certain buckets. If I were more famous, then having me more than once would make sense. Or if I was, one of his comedy friends or something. But for what I do, once was probably enough.
Well, this has been a rare treat. I could ask you a whole new set of questions every couple of months with all the stuff that you comment on. It's quite fascinating. Thank you so much for coming on here. Before we get you out of here, I have to say, your book Loserthink was called the best book of the millennium by one of your fans. Why do people love Loserthink so much?
Well, there's always somebody who says that about all of my books, so you have to put that in context. But different books hit people sometimes exactly when they need them. So it's more about this weird combination of the perfect combination of the person and what they need in their life, the questions they have, and the book. Every now and then, it's a perfect fit. So, maybe Win Bigly is your perfect fit. Maybe Loserthink is somebody else's perfect fit. But it's about that weird accident of perfect fit.
Well, for me, I'm going to say again, since I got it right here, my perfect fit was How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big. I know Loserthink is the brand new one, but everyone, you got to check this book out as well. Scott Adams, go ahead.
They're written so that the three of them kind of make sense as a trilogy. So just keep that in mind.
Get all three, everybody. To the potentially millions of people listening to this, get all three. Scott Adams, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to all the tens of millions, I assume, people watching this. And I appreciate it. Thanks a lot.